Counterterrorism Today. Up-to-date analysis with Dan Diker.
Welcome to Counterterrorism Today. I'm Dan Diker, and today we're going to be talking about radicalization, the heart and soul of international terror. With me today are two of the leading experts on the issue of radicalization, and very happy to have with us Dr. Anan Wahabi, who is a professor of political science at the University of Haifa. He's an expert in radicalization, Islamic terror, and has served in various roles in the Israel Defense Forces. He's a colonel, reserved or retired, as they say, and he was a senior advisor in the Prime Minister's office on issues of radical Islam and radicalization. And we also have, very pleased to have with us a lecturer at King's College, London, one of the great centers for the study of warfare and political science and criminology, among other areas of social science. And that is Dr. Sagit Yehoshua. It's really nice to have you with us, both of you, Dr. Wahabi and Dr. Yehoshua. And we're going to be talking about today the various aspects of radicalization. Is this the heart and soul of international terror? How do we understand it? Because without radicalization, there is no terror. What do you think, Dr. Wahabi?
Well, first of all, those who want to change the world have a very deep reason. Politically, they want to achieve something, and I assume that in this case, when we talk about religious radicalism, people tend to use religion in order to use it in the case of politics in order to get their goals and their targets. So this religiosity is very much political. People are using the religion in order to achieve the political targets.
What do you think, Dr. Yehoshua? How do we understand the heart of the term radicalization? Some people will say what is radicalization to some people is just a firm set of beliefs to another. Is there an objective way of understanding radicalization?
Radicalization is a process. It's not something that happened in a day. And therefore, it's very important to understand the process and how ones can go into this process and I mean, acquire these type of belief and thoughts, as you mentioned. I think that if you compare it to what's going on in Israel, the process of radicalization is something that happens from birth. So it's kind of a different process than what we see today in Europe or in less so in the United States. People that come from different problems or issues that they need to face with, like identity crisis or immigrations or stuff like that they are dealing with, and therefore they are starting this process of radicalization.
Well, let's talk about that. That's actually a very important distinction that you draw, because there are those who are listening and watching this program who are experiencing what they would call Islamic radicalization in Europe, whether it's with regard to the recent terror attacks in France, in Belgium, and in other areas in Europe. And they experience a type of radicalization that may be fundamentally different than what we're seeing here in the Middle East. How do you understand radicalization among second-generation youth in France, for example, who join ISIS, who join Al-Qaeda? Is this a psychological issue for them, or is it an issue of victory, of ideological victory for them to join such groups?
It definitely comes from different aspects. It doesn't mean that, you know, these people, they were born into certain circumstances and they feel different from how their parents felt when they first arrived to the country. Their parents feel a bit more grateful to these countries. However, the second generation and the third one doesn't see it that way. They feel humiliated, they feel second-class citizens. In a sense, they live in a very pluralist society, but they don't feel belong. They have a strong identity crisis, they need belonging, they need to feel empowered, and they don't have it, and they're looking for it. And the process of radicalization, to be, you know, attached to a group that is very strong, that sent very strong message, is very empowering.
So when you look at someone, if you look at Zawahiri from Qaeda, or you look at Baghdadi of ISIS, are these the type of leadership profiles that really speak to young people in the West? Because on the one hand, these young Western disaffected people look Western, they act Western, they are engaged in all things Western. On the other hand, they're hearing these messages that bring them to places like Syria and Iraq, in what is known now as in parts of those states as the Islamic State, and they're beheading fellow Muslims. How do you square that circle, Dr. Wahabi? We'll come back to you too, Sagit.
We should make the distinction, and I think you will agree with me that there is a big distinction between the leaders of terrorism, those who tell the believers how the world should be, are trying to influence the new generation and to tell them how to act in order to achieve their goals, and the communities. By and large, we know that Islam lives in a community. And when we talk about the European immigrants, the second generation in particular, they are influenced very much inside the community. They need the community on the one hand, and they are trying to emerge in the hosting state, unsuccessfully in a lot of cases. And here, those voices of Zawahiri and others is very much affecting their hearts and minds, and try to move them to take action. And especially lately, when they are hearing the ISIS ideological voices telling them to act against the West. There is that foreign civilization that is opposing Islam as a part of the enemies of the Islam in their understanding. So in a very frustrating minute, they can be taking action and doing something, which is part of the problem.
But if we're saying that the radicalization is a problem for the West and its attempts to confront and perhaps defeat this international scourge of terror, most of it being sourced in radical Islam, how come most of the victims of radical Islamic terror are Muslims?
Well, we know that Bernard Lewis told us that 90% of the terror actions that were taken lately are Islamic. He also said that not all the Islam are religious, not all the religious are radical, and not all the radical are come to that extreme part of taking terror action. So that is the situation. There is a very big frustration. Something went wrong with this civilization. We could see that in the Arab Spring around us, and they are trying to calculate their way once again. There is a deep, really frustration, and they miss the way. So they are listening much more to the voices of the radical people that are coming from the religious background, rather than listening to the national agendas.
You know, Dr. Yehoshua, in the United States as compared to the United Kingdom, where you're a professor of criminology and an expert in radicalization, you don't see, at least at this point, public displays of radicalization the way you do in London, which is the epicenter, some say, in Europe, certainly for Hamas and Hamas-affiliated activity and radicalization demonstrations, where you will see people like Professor Tamimi, who will stand up in front of thousands of people and call for the destruction of the very culture that, London and England, in which he is preaching. How do you give us a sense of the threat of radicalization to the larger host communities in the West, like London itself? What does it say about the United Kingdom?
I think it says a lot about their immigration policies. I think they have a big problem with how to attract immigrants and how to deal with immigration. You see it in Germany, you see it in Belgium, you see it in France, and I think less so in London, but still as well in London, that people don't feel integrated. They don't feel part of the community. French immigrants don't feel French. But if you compare it to the United States, for example, if you see Muslims since 9/11, definitely feels like they're Americans, because the United States is a place that know how to deal with immigration. I think it's the same as Israel, that it's deal with immigration in a sense that that's how we were created, and the same thing as the United States. You don't see the same thing in Europe, and that's, I think, the problem.
So it's, again, very compelling, Dr. Yehoshua, that you mention Israel with regard to the challenge to radicalization. Dr. Wahabi, an expert in Islamic radicalism in Israel, we don't see real public displays of radicalism other than that which is advanced by Sheikh Raed Salah in the Northern Islamic movement. Give us some perspective on radicalization in Israel.
Yeah, the Israeli Arab citizens tend much more to be Israelis than to be Palestinians, although something like 40% of them consider themselves Palestinians, and that they belong also to the Palestinian narrative and the history. And they care a lot for what should be done with the peace process later on. But we know that when it comes to Islamism, Raed Salah is trying to influence people to tend much more to the Islamic agenda, which is opposes totally the existence of foreign countries and regimes in a historic Islamic state, and they consider Palestine as an Islamic state historically. So they are trying to influence. On the other hand, they are very much pragmatic. They do that step by step. And then they understand that the huge majority of the Israeli citizens, Arab citizens I mean, love the fact that they are part of this state, and they try to emerge here. They are living better than a lot of Arab communities in the Middle East all over. So their influence is very little. And we could see also lately that the ISIS influence was also affected a very small numbers of Israeli people that tried to join also terrorism. In this sense, Raed Salah became a very radical story in the Israeli local Arab citizens in Israel and community.
You know, when you talk about radicalism in the name of Islam, and you brought up Professor Lewis's name, and he today, of course, is 100 years old, and he is the oldest and probably greatest living authority on Islam in the West. And what Professor Lewis had said in the years that he would come to Israel, that not so many people knew for 3 months out of the year, he would say that the question of radicalization in Islam is not really a question of what we know in the West as radical Islam. It's a challenge to Islam itself. To what degree do you agree with that or not agree with that?
There are a lot of voices that are saying that there is no, the expression radical Islam is something that is making a big, leading us to different understanding, because radicalism, that the way that the West is calling that is part of the original Islam, in a way that the Islam has Dar al-Islam, which is the house of Islam, and all the others, and they divide the other fields of the humanity to what we call others, and there is a very little tolerance to those others, other religions, other cultures, nationalities, etc. And the Islamic issue is very much political from the very beginning. It came from the Arab Peninsula as part of the Arabism, and Arabism came from the Dune culture, which is tribal. They live in communities. There is always enemy and rivals, always. So they came with the same understanding and the same political way, and the Islam adopted that, and we could see that this confrontation between the Islamic sphere and the Islamic civilization with others is surviving, acting, living all the way.
So then if we have 1,600,000,000 Muslims, about, give or take one or two, around the world, the vast majority of Muslims have not been radicalized.
That's right.
Why not?
Because they are pragmatic, because Islam has different types. There are the radical Arab Islam, there are the moderate Arab Islam, there are something like what we can try to call it secular Arab Islam. We spoke to people that they consider themselves not religious. So I don't know if not religious is to be secular or not. So those definitions are really very, very much open, but not all of them are coming from the same type, and not to mention the non-Arab Islam types, which are much more moderate.
You mean like from the Deobandi school of thought, those in Asia, or those
in Asia,
well, the largest perhaps where we don't see radicalization so much, correct me if I'm wrong, is in Indonesia, the largest Muslim population in the world.
That's right.
So we've talked about the politicization of religion. How to create radicalization? How do we fight radicalization? Is it a war that can be won, Sagit?
The $1 million question.
Is that before tax?
I don't think so. How do you fight radicalization? I think we need to take it from different approaches. The idea of education, the idea of approaching immigration differently. There's so many ways that we need to think about before, and it's varied in different places. How you approach it in Europe different than how you approach it in Israel or in the United States or in Indonesia, for that matter. Every place is different, and every place deprived. They have their own deprivations, have their own issues and own circumstances that you need to deal with. I think education is one of the main things that is very, very important in every place. In Israel, definitely. In London, in Europe, and so it's really a question of how you approach it, how you look at it. I think in London it's a good example of a place that try to understand the mindset and behavior and the motivations and deprivations of these people, and how is the right way to approach to them, how you can communicate with these people, how you can understand how they work and be able to have some sort of communication, better communication with them. And according to this communication, to understand what are their needs, and how to deal with it.
So can radicalization be overcome by Western actors, or is it really a war within Islam that has to be defeated from within Islam?
Wonderful, wonderful. I think it's a very central question, because I think that we all those that are trying to solve this question should avoid indoctrination. I mean, when they what the Islam call the West should not come with their understanding how the world should be, and to try to take those Islamic communities to that reality in a way that this indoctrination is going to educate their second generation and their children how they should be, how they should believe, of course, and how they should interact in their Western communities where they live. So I agree that first of all empathy is needed. We should understand their state of mind. The second generation in particular, not to mention the third one, are likely to be seeking again their identity. They study from the West, from the interaction inside the Western community, that they had to find their identity always. So they look at that and they look back, and there is a fallback. The fallback is their cultural, political, cultural, religious, let's say, well-prepared story and narrative, which is there always. So when they are frustrated, when they are not integrated in the hosting country, the fallback is always Islamic inside the community. So one of the successful things to do is to try to get them integrated, to understand them, and on the one hand. On the other hand, I think that the West know that very much. They should be acting in order to stop any kind of terrorism and everything that is related to terrorism very firmly.
Meaning no tolerance policy,
no tolerance.
which would act in a way as a deterrent to radicalization,
right,
because they realize the price would be very high.
That's right.
So here's another $1 million question that is asked in the West all the time. They look at the range of terror attacks that have taken place in the West, and until I think the recent spate of French atrocities in Paris, this notion that radicalization is a result of socioeconomic deprivation prevailed in the West, and that they frankly use that in trying to understand terrorism in Israel. They say, well, if you give the Palestinians a state, or you deal with Hamas more honorably, and you prevent all kinds of restrictions from taking place, then radicalization will decrease. But yet, when you look at 9/11, that happened in Washington, New York, these were people with doctorates like yours, and these are people who are educated and people that had money. So then, are we saying here that radicalization is more of an ideological issue than it is a socioeconomic issue in both of your experiences in Europe, in London, and in Israel and throughout the Middle East?
Well, I think here when people have, on the one hand, education, and on the other hand, they are frustrated. Frustration, this will be the fuel to take action and to be opposing the reality that they are watching. And in the cases that you mentioned, we could find a lot of educated people that are coming from a reality that, an inconvenient reality, that they could not accept the political status, the socioeconomic status. Their integration can be personally or the communal level inside the countries and the communities that they are living in. And they, in some moment, they are inspired by those preachers that tell them to take action. And we should remember that in the new media, they are surviving all the way. Those radical voices that are coming from the ideology and the theology of radical Islam, they are surviving, they are acting. One of the counter actions that we should be aware of is to be trying to influence their minds and their hearts with a counter agenda, to tell the youth that that there is a future and there is a very optimistic horizon where it can be they can go, and what should be done, and also to try to help them to emerge in the societies.
Tell us very quickly, as we consider these last elements in our discussion, what happens in places in Europe like prisons and schools and other places in the public domain that are hotbeds of radicalism? Where are the real hotbeds in Europe, which is really facing this immigration crisis as well, of thousands and thousands of Middle Easterners coming into their borders? Where are the soft spots for radicalization today?
Research has shown that most radicalization occur within life happening situation, meaning meeting people, knowing not solely by the internet. Unlike the States, for example, where there you don't have many charismatic and relevant people that relates to this process of radicalization. So yes, prisons, schools, mosques are places where
places of human interaction, of human engagement.
Exactly. In London, for example, the policy is that terrorists, people that are charged in terrorist activities, and criminals are all together. And in that circumstances, you can radicalize both sides. And it happens that people became radicals, criminals became radicals, and radicals learn, the manipulative ways of criminality. So we do have these places that influence radicalization in that sense.
And in Israel, as we started with Israel, perhaps we'll end with Israel. What should people know in the West? Our colleagues in the West are watching and listening to this program, hopefully. And what do they need to learn about the type of conflict and the radicalization that leads to the type of Hamas leadership, that leads to the type of extremism that we see from Hezbollah, that we see from the Islamic Jihad in the West Bank as well as in Gaza, that we see among other Salafist cells that we're seeing, that we see among Iranian regime cells in the West Bank today? What is there a common denominator that the West needs to know about radicalization here? Because their view of what's going on here and causes terror is a political conflict. And there are experts like yourselves that say, well, wait a second, there's a whole ideological component of what is driving terrorism in Israel in this very unstable Middle East.
Yeah, I'm afraid that when we watch the behavior of those terrorist groups, we could think that they are seeking to solve the problem and the crisis here between the Israel and the Palestinians. But I'm afraid that they are not. They gain a lot, and they are trying to continue gaining from this crisis. Hamas, on the one hand, are part of the Palestinian sphere. They know exactly how to be part of the national Palestinian agenda, but on the other hand, they know how to oppose the Fatah inside the Palestinian side and to be something else that belong to the Islamic Brotherhood, that are coming with different ideology, that is not accepting the peace process totally, etc. So it's an open system. They are pragmatic on the one hand, and they are very extreme on the other hand, and they know how to use the cards the way they want. Same thing with Hezbollah. They exploit their sitting on our borders. For them, is a very strategic thing that they are using against us and for their benefit. They are pragmatic very much, and they have their patrons. By the way, Iran is the patron, used to be the patron either for Hamas and, of course, for Hezbollah. So they are part of a larger system, which is a regional one, and they are there using their tools just in the way that can serve their political agenda. So here I think that we are living in something of, we call it enduring conflict, that the terror organizations are part of those tools that the rival side of Israel, the counterpart of Israel that is trying to really act against us, are using them in order to influence our behavior. And I think it's a very long way still to be solved.
A long way to be solved. It seems that radicalization is here to stay for the meanwhile, and we have a lot of work ahead of us. I hope that we'll have the opportunity to sit like this at this round table and discuss, hopefully, improvements in combating terrorist radicalization. I'd like to thank both of you for now. Dr. Anan Wahabi, an expert in radicalization, political Islam, radical Islam, a lecturer and professor at the University of Haifa, and also Sagit Yehoshua, Dr. Sagit Yehoshua, who is a lecturer at King's College London and an expert in criminology and radicalization. Thank you both ever so much for joining us on Counterterrorism today.
Thank you.